this is the story we've been waiting for. We're hoping for a long time. Peace in Ukraine. Could this actually happen? Just a short time ago, President Trump got off the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin then came out to the podium to say a few words about how that phone call went. Watch this.
Добрый вечер. Коллеги просили сказать несколько слов о результатах.
The results of our telephone conversation with the President of the United States, indeed, this conversation took place. It lasted more than 2 hours. I would like to note it was very informative and very frank. So that was, and it goes on from there. He spoke for about another few minutes. The President of the United States also releasing an update from his Truth Social account, saying just completed a 2-hour call with Vladimir Putin. Basically says we're trying to end this catastrophic bloodbath. There's tremendous opportunity for Russia to do massive trade deals with the United States, jobs, wealth. The potential is unlimited. He says he also spoke with Zelenskyy. He basically says, peace, peace, peace. Let the process begin. Let's bring in Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who worked for President Trump and has, of course, been calling for peace from the very beginning. Make peace, you fools. Is it too early, Colonel, for us to be popping the champagne here? I get very excited when I see this from both sides. I don't want you to rain on my parade. I don't want you to
But he wants an honest answer.
But I want an honest answer. Is my champagne going to be flat?
I would keep the cork in the bottle and keep the champagne cool.
Okay.
I think that, first of all, President Putin is always polite. And he was polite in his comments. I don't know the substance of the whole discussion. The only way to know that is to see the transcript. But I think from some of the things that I heard him say and the rest of the presentation, that the Russians are certainly ready for a ceasefire, but provided the preconditions for such a thing are actually met. And remember, the Russians have unchanging goals, and he reiterated that. Their position is established, it's well known. We want a neutral Ukraine. We want a denazified Ukraine, and so forth. We're not interested in simply stopping the war in order to pause long enough for Ukraine to receive more weapons, ammunition, and support from Ukraine's allies in Washington and in Europe. There's no evidence at this point in time that those goals and those conditions, frankly, are going to be met. Now, I know that the Pope has now offered to mediate, and that's nice. And I'm sure that President Putin will be delighted to have the Pope step in and do whatever he can do. I think we have to keep in mind that Putin wants good relations with the United States. He's dealt with President Trump before, and he knows that President Trump has frequently said things that ultimately didn't turn out to be accurate because he was unable to impose his will on his own government. So I think, to sum up briefly, yeah, I'm sure it was constructive. I'm sure there will be some discussions now between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Whether or not that's going to lead to a substantive ceasefire is very unclear. And I think the chances are not that great.
What do you make of Zelenskyy being excluded from this talk, which seems to be the most fruitful? What it says to me is that his presence is like when mommy and daddy are talking, you need to be quiet, that he is only a hindrance. And what he said in his X post after he spoke to President Trump is, it is crucial that the United States not distance itself from these talks, meaning I can't do it. I'm at the kids' table still. It's got to be the United States and Russia.
Well, it always had to be us because we are the driving force behind the war. If you take us out of the equation, there is no war. There would not have been a coup in 2014. Right. Wouldn't have had any biolabs. The massive quantities of weaponry, which President Trump also approved and sent to Ukraine while he was in his first term, those things wouldn't have happened. So this thing can only end ultimately with one of two things happening. Either we stop supporting Zelenskyy, full stop, and that has to happen, and we pull all of the Americans in and out of uniform out of Ukraine. That's one way to end this. That's a very serious action that guarantees the first serious, decisive step in the direction of a ceasefire. If that doesn't happen, the only other alternative is that Zelenskyy and his inner circle probably don't survive too much longer. The Russians cross the Dnieper River and seize Kiev and probably also eventually Odessa. Maybe one before the other, I don't know. But right now, the Russians are moving to the west, and they're going to continue to move until they've closed up on the Dnieper River. That's not going to stop. And they've made that very clear that whatever goes on during these talks, until the conditions that they've outlined take place, nothing will change. They will continue to advance. So under those circumstances, that's why I think it's very unlikely you're going to get an end to this thing. And the sad part of all of this is I think because of the positions that President Trump has taken, that have been very, very misguided in my view, he is really irrelevant to the process. Unless he intervenes to stop the flow of armaments, cash, ammunitions, and support to the Zelenskyy regime, and then pulls us out, frankly, whatever he does is not going to be taken very seriously. And right now, there are a lot of people in Moscow saying to Putin behind the scenes, why bother? You know, why believe anything the man says? What evidence do we have that the Americans are serious about anything? Nothing survives an election cycle. You know, the policies are too incoherent and unpredictable. So stay the course, finish the war, end it on our terms, whatever that turns out to be. I think all of those things are happening in Moscow. But I think Mr. Putin knows President Trump. He wants to be polite to him. And I'm sure he said nice things to him and said yes. But he also said, as I understand it, a ceasefire provided the preconditions we've discussed in the past are met. And until those are met, and that includes an end to all of this military aid to Zelenskyy, I don't see anything halting. I think the war will continue and the advance to the West will continue.
I mean, you're hitting at the heart of the matter here, which is that Putin holds all the cards. You've seen Europe, of course, aligning itself. They want to funnel more weapons and support to Zelenskyy. Even when Trump and J.D. Vance had that White House meeting where they chastised Zelenskyy and said, you know, we're not going to be a party to this. You don't hold the cards here. It seems what can you worked for President Trump? What can he do here, if anything, to stop this? Does he have the power just over Europe to say, stop sending weapons into Ukraine, stop supporting this, stop supporting Nazis inside of Ukraine? All of that. I mean, it seems like an incredibly tall order. If not, then are we just going to continue this? Does this war just continue for years?
Well, listen, first, you're right. Absolutely right, Clayton. He can bring tremendous pressure to bear on our allies. There are things he can do. But for whatever reason, he has chosen not to do that. And I don't see any evidence that he's suddenly going to turn around and do it. That's why the easiest thing for him is to put the Europeans who refuse to play ball on his terms in an indefensible position. What is that? Pull the plug on Zelenskyy. Pull the plug on Kyiv. Sorry, folks, we're out. We've had it. We'll be happy to host, the peace conference, but we're out. We're not doing any more. Remember that the European leaders are not reflecting the views that their populations hold. No one in Germany wants to go to war with Russia. Forget it. I don't see any evidence that anyone in France does. Now, I don't know what is going on in Great Britain, and I think it's almost impossible to tell. That place is so heavily censored and so oppressive these days, I can't evaluate. But my sense tells me that there aren't very many Englishmen lining up to go to fight in Eastern Europe. The Poles have made it abundantly clear they don't want anything to do with the war there. Now you have the crazy Estonians that have tried to provoke the Russians, and now they're in a lot of trouble because the Russians have taken a tanker, and they've made it pretty clear that they could shut down Estonia, in 24 hours, unless the Estonians shut up and start behaving like adults. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to be drawn into that. And of course, that's exactly what somebody like Mark Rutte would cheer on. He'd love to see that because he's part of this globalist elite class that wants to lead Europe, further down on the road into hell, where they've practically hit bottom as it is. So, no, I think it's a matter of pulling the rug out from under the Europeans by taking decisive action on his part to say, that's it, I'm out. Now, he could do that. He could wait to see what this new discussion amounts to. Wait to see if the Ukrainians go in there and take a different position. The Russians have some wiggle room. There's no question about it. They would like to end this thing. How wide and broad that wiggle room is, I don't know, but I think it exists. But the Ukrainians are the ones that have just said flat out, no, they're not going to recognize the legitimacy of anything that the Russians have done, because that would put into jeopardy the raison d'etre for their entire regime. So my suspicion is that if this fails, the smart thing for President Trump to do is say, well, I've talked to all the parties. This is the best I can do. There is no will right now to end this. So I'm doing the following. I'm leaving. I'm ending my relationship with the Kiev regime. And I think that's the best way to promote peace. Now, everyone in Washington will revolt against him, but they're irrelevant because the American population has no damn interest whatsoever in what happens in Ukraine. Wake up. Nobody here wants to go to war there. Forget it.
Right.
Yeah. And so something Zelenskyy said in this, I mean, he speaks nonsense all the time, but it's as if he thinks he has pull over what America does. And so he says if Russia continues to drag out this war, then they will deserve it when Europe and America and the world act accordingly, including with further sanctions. So he thinks he's leading this. And he's like, I'm going to set my dogs on you, as if America's going to do what he says. He's such an incredibly dangerous little mole.
Well, he is dangerous because he's backed by most of the same people who are backing Netanyahu. And that's what you have to understand. He's not out there on his own. This globalist elite, it's a very, very powerful triangular relationship. You have the Western globalist elites, then you have Netanyahu, and you have Zelenskyy. They are all mutually reinforcing. There is, however, a difference. And the difference very clearly is that the populations are 100% opposed to marching east into Ukraine. And NATO is very, very fragile at this point, as is the EU. Those institutions are not going to survive this experience. I don't care what anybody says publicly. Behind the scenes, those are dead men walking. So frankly, if you're Putin right now, you thank everybody for their interest in peace. You compliment them and pay tribute to them and thank President Trump and all the efforts that he's making. And you send people out to talk and you turn to the general staff and says, let me know when you're on the outskirts of Kiev.
Jeez. Well, Colonel, we'll get you out of here on this. Last week, you heard from the Trump administration that if Putin doesn't come to the peace talks table, we're at massive sanctions, like crushing sanctions. Of course, we heard that under Biden, and Russia's GDP has increased. Their factories are humming along. They've moved further away from the U.S. dollar. They've aligned themselves with BRICS nations even more closely with China, et cetera. So those sanctions absolutely had the opposite effect. And then we heard from J.D. Vance today on a gaggle on an Air Force plane saying, if Putin doesn't come to the table on this, or if we don't have peace talks, then we're ready to say goodbye. So what two things, how do you square those two things? Massive sanctions, number one, would those work against Putin and Russia? Number two, we're just going to walk away. Is that possible? The U.S. would just totally wash its hands and walk away?
Well, I think, first of all, you've answered your own question. No one in Russia is surprised by the sanctions threat. They're quite prepared for that. Remember, Putin just a few weeks ago spoke to the leaders of all the major industries and firms in the private sector in Russia and said it's time to come to terms with reality that these sanctions are never going to go away. The West is not going to finally wake up and turn back towards us and recognize that we're not the enemy. So we have to build bridges elsewhere. Those bridges are being built. It's called BRICS. And of course, you have the other supporting organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Council and other entities, but they're all part of the same. Let's move away from the United States. Let's get out from under these people. Let's no longer be dependent upon them so that we can live in peace. In other words, in a very interesting way, the Chinese, the Russians, and the whole global South and everybody is practicing a form of containment towards us. We're seen as this rogue state, this unstable superpower that could lurch in the wrong direction at any given point in time. So what do? Well, you put as much distance between you and them as you can. And that includes reducing your economic dependency on them. So I think that's really what's going on. And I don't think anybody in Russia is terribly worried about the sanctions. And I know that President Trump continues to impute great importance to them, though I think privately he would like to get rid of them entirely. But you have something similar happening in the Middle East. And I think you need to understand that the Ukraine business is going to go away for the reasons we've already discussed. This war is going to end on Russia's terms. Vance is right. We'll just walk away because we can't do anything else. And eventually we will lift the sanctions. But in the meantime, we can't do that for fear of looking as though we've lost. Well, welcome to the real world. We lost a long time ago in Ukraine, and we've lost badly in Europe. It's not going to be a nice withdrawal from Europe. The years ahead, it's going to be ugly, and our position in that part of the world is going to be terrible. But when you go to the other pole in this triangular relationship, Mr. Netanyahu, that's a very different set of circumstances because Zelenskyy commands very little influence on the Hill. He is given tacit support, but Mr. Netanyahu commands far more influence in the Senate and the House than President Trump does. So
obviously, we saw that. Sorry, I was going to say we saw that over the weekend with all the Israeli anniversary celebrations. It was cacophonous. Sorry.
No, you're dead right, Natalie, and people need to take that seriously. They need to understand that when it comes to anything of importance to Israel, Mr. Netanyahu is the de facto president, not Trump.
100%. Yeah. I've long been saying that here on the show, and people get angry with me when we say the real president of the United States. But, you know, that's the case.
Sometimes I maintain this illusion when I see the things that President Trump does because he built so many bridges last week in the Middle East. And it was incredibly encouraging that Israel was not leading him to do those things. And in fact, they weren't in Israel's interest. And then he comes home and the first thing he does is an anti-Semitism message on the White House X account. And I think maybe there's a play here that I just can't see, that he's, trying to be nice in order to back us out of this. And I don't know how that would work. This is just my blind faith at this point. So do you have any?
Yeah, and Natalie, you're on to something that's very important. He was in the Middle East last week for the purpose of doing several things. Number one, he wants to try and coax the Emirates as well as Saudi Arabia into not joining BRICS. Well, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And the money and the investment that he's talking about, he wants to keep it in the United States, what they've already got here, and he would like to add to it because of our very fragile position in the finance markets. The 10-year bond yield continues to rise. And the worst thing that could happen to him and to, frankly, our economy would be for those Saudis and Emirates to suddenly pull their cash completely out of the United States. If they were to do that, we would be in a lot of trouble. For that matter, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the others, if they do the same thing, we've really had it financially. That's how bad the situation is for us right now. But then there's one other last part that doesn't get much attention. And that is that President Trump is also working very hard to hold together this Turkish-Israeli pact for hegemony over the region. Everyone was upset when he shook hands with Jolani. Well, shaking hands with Jolani was necessary for him to hold Erdogan inside this alliance with Israel. And when I say alliance, that's probably the wrong word. It's more like a non-aggression pact between the Nazis and the Soviets. And he wants to keep that together because that's the linchpin for hegemony for them and for, in his mind, for our continued influence. I think he's very wrong, and I think that will ultimately fall apart. And I think we can already see the outlines of that collapse coming. And that's going to be very ugly because then Israel will absolutely stand completely alone in the region. But that's something else that we probably can't prevent. But I think that's a big part of what he was trying to do. So while people think, oh, this must upset the Israelis because he promised to send the F-15 now to Turkey. He's made these kinds of promises before, and a month or two later, well, I guess we can't do that. So I don't know that everyone is taking all of that as seriously over there as the public is here. Remember, we have this expression, flash to bang time in the military. You see the guns flash, and then you count a certain number of seconds, and then you hear the explosion. And that tells you roughly the distance. Well, for President Trump, flash to bang time needs to be short and quick to get the most exposure and media support out of it as he can extract. I think he did that this week, but I don't think it's going to last.
All right, Colonel. Well, we'll keep watching out. Watching
jokes and live it up here or something. I mean, can't we?
I know. I was like, I didn't like any of that, but I need to hear it. I didn't come here to be told what I like.
Yeah,
so.
the truth, a realist. You know, because you get all these people, you get all these X accounts. They're like, this is the greatest thing in the world. And you know, you've been there. You've been inside the White House. You know exactly how this all works. And, you know, people need to understand the truth behind all of this. Colonel, great to see you as always. We'll be watching this very, very closely as always. Thanks, Colonel.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.